and then we can get started.
Should I introduce since I can be interviewing or? Okay.
Yeah, I think we already have an intro recorded by Tina. Oh, I guess maybe we should introduce Jackie, all the people here. We have Grace, we have Tina, and then we have Jashin, and then we have Chris. Like, awesome. I guess, have you met Chris before?
I don't think so. Hi, Chris.
No, we haven't met. I worked for TEDx with Joe.
Oh, no kidding. Okay, fun.
So yeah, we're reunited.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it feels so good.
Jashin is our producer. Grace have been generating a ton of blog in our newsletter. Nice. And then Tina's been doing a lot of product audit and then curating products. So yeah, so we're being like really enjoying this like podcast recording thing. And so we're like super excited. We're having Joe interviewing today because like that, you know, we wouldn't know you if it wasn't Joe. So.
Oh, okay. Sounds good.
Yeah, I guess we could just jump right in. So today we're really excited to have, sorry, Jackie, I blanked on your last name.
No, it's okay. Bowen.
Bowen, right?
Bowen.
Okay. Start over. All right. So today we're really excited to have Jackie Bowen with us with the Clean Label Project. And I'm just going to let her introduce the Clean Label Project. It's her nonprofit. And could you give us a little background and of the Clean Label Project and your overall mission?
Yeah, sure. So Clean Label Project, we're a national nonprofit headquartered out of Colorado, the national nonprofit with the mission to bring truth and transparency to consumer product labeling. So at its core, the way we look at the world is that marketing departments do a really effective job at selling comfort and security. But go figure, you know, tandem LC mass spectrometers and GC mass spectrometers, they don't lie. So we like relying on data and science in order to be able to assess what's truly in America's best-selling products. For me, I'm a food safety and quality systems engineer by training, which I like to tell people that makes me a professional buzzkill at dinner parties. But nevertheless, I feel like I find myself in pretty good company with you guys.
Yes, definitely. Would you agree that what is on the label is often not what is in the product?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, we definitely talk about that a lot. So yeah, we'd love to hear more about your journey in creating your organization. And do you have any kind of personal stories that motivated you in creating this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of Clean Label Project, so Clean Label Project was actually founded probably about 5 or 6 years ago. So I wasn't the founder of it. It was actually an investigative reporter that was originally with New Hope Natural Media. What brought me to Clean Label Project was that for 15 years, I worked for the World Health Organization Collaborating Center, NSF International, working on food safety and water quality standards, helping to bring to market different types of certification programs like Certified Organic, Non-GMO Project, Certified Gluten-Free, all of which to me are very personally as well as professionally important and rewarding. However, it's been interesting that over the past several years, as you've seen this proliferation of on-package label claims that I fondly refer to as Girl Scout badges, you see this increase in kind of consumer media and, you know, science kind of like research attention being paid to the links between industrial and environmental contaminants and toxins and their links to long-term chronic disease. The kicker is it's like you see things play out in media all the time. I'm sure you guys see it too, where it's like levels of glyphosate in America's best-selling breakfast cereals, levels of heavy metals in America's best-selling baby foods, levels of BPA leaching from America's favorite sparkling waters into the actual product packaging, you know, and consumers in the court of law, technically, these products are compliant, but in the court of public opinion, it's a different story. So at Clean Label Project, what we look to do is bridge the gap between the two. It's like, yeah, compliance with the court of law, that's table stakes. Compliance with the court of public opinion, that's your true north. Bridging the gap to make sure that you align your true north with what consumers perceive to be actual quality and safety is kind of like, that's the intersection where Clean Label Project lives. In terms of what kind of brought me and my interest to this is having grown up in Michigan, it's one where everything and being a public health practitioner myself, everything that happened in Flint, Michigan, and then kind of watching all of the studies that have been released since then has been both horrifying as well as, interesting when you look at the underlying, situation. So for those of your listeners not familiar with kind of the Flint, Michigan saga that even to this day still continues, would be that, several years ago, the Flint, Michigan, the city of Flint switched their drinking water from the Detroit River over to the Flint River. And in the process of doing so, they didn't use the necessary preservatives to prevent the lead pipes from leaching into the drinking water. It exposed this population of people in Flint to elevated levels of lead in their drinking water. And then what happened? Then all of this public health stuff that happened since then. So with Flint, it was interesting because, you hear a lot about it on the news, and this was 5-6 years ago. But since then, you really don't hear anything about it. But it's interesting because, after Katie Couric leaves, after Anderson Cooper leaves, after the Heal the World, Make It a Better Place concerts are over, then the epidemiologists roll in to figure out what are the actual repercussions of this actual human case study that just happened about elevated levels of exposure. Since then, the studies that have been released show reduced fertility levels in women of childbearing age. The percent of children that can read at proficient at grade level in the 3rd grade has fallen from north of 50% to just south of 20%. And even more recently, these children that were exposed to these elevated levels of lead during their most formative years, 25% of children now entering grade school qualify as special education. So the public education school system is literally crumbling under the weight of this exposure to heavy metals. And so it's one for me where it's, you hear of these different stories, that all of the stories you hear about related to industrial environmental contaminants, their effect on long-term health is important. But literally it was one where I didn't grow up in Flint, but it was about 20 miles north of where I did grow up. So you hear some of these stories that also hit home pretty close.
Definitely. So what motivated you to take the kind of consumer advocacy route rather than maybe a government route or a industry route, or within your efforts in your career?
Yeah. So right now, it's just a really interesting time to be a consumer with social media. It's one where it's so easy to be I like referring to it as a good troublemaker, so to speak, right? It takes forever. It's like this glacial speed in which things happen from a regulatory perspective. But when you can go into the marketplace and you can test America's best-selling products and see what's in it, and you provide this information to consumers, they can make real choices right now in the food that they provide for themselves as well as for their families. Well, that's, even right now, there's a lot of movement around levels of heavy metals in baby food and potential, regulatory action being taken, which is great. The thing is, it's like when you start talking about, oh, we're going to gather data for 5, 6, 7 years, it's like, okay, by the time my kid, is driving, I'll know what I should feed them for their infant formula. That doesn't really help anybody. And so for me, it's a matter of, if you can just get directly to consumers using social media, I just look at it as consumer awareness and education can ultimately pull through industry and regulatory reform.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was interesting to see this huge, quick response to the coronavirus pandemic. Within a year, something that usually takes 5 to 10 years, they develop something. And if that level of effort is put into this, emergency, which we are experiencing, imagine.
Oh, it's true.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one where even on the whole coronavirus thing, when I think about it and I think about just the very limited budget that exists when it comes to kind of public health protection, and then you factor into like, wow, this virus that has a very low rate of mortality, which is a good thing.
Right.
How quickly and the ease and the speed at which it was able to bring the economy to its knees tells you that it's like, no, we've got some other things that are a very real threat to both the economy as well as public health and safety.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, kind of going from that, consumers hear about BPA and maybe PFAS and phthalates and all these chemicals, and we hear about them in the news and we know they're bad, but they can feel kind of abstract or a distant danger, or we don't really know how it affects us. So my question for you is, what's one thing that consumers should know about toxic chemicals in their food and products? And is there immediate concern for these chemicals?
Yeah, I guess I would say the one thing that I found really interesting, especially looking at BPA phthalates and kind of some of the things in the plasticizer realm, is you see a lot of these claims on product packaging saying BPA free. But the thing that's, to me, and you guys will appreciate this, looking at analytical chemistry reports and stuff like that, is a lot. I remember one time testing a few products. Actually, I'll use this other example, looking at protein powders. And over 50% of the best-selling protein powders had measurable levels of BPA. Now, the thing that's interesting is so often when people talk about BPA, they think of it as like, oh, we use BPA free packaging, and therefore that means our product is BPA free. It's not necessarily the case. It's like BPA can exist all across the supply chain. Within food production and industrial food production, you have drying racks. You have, just like how you have wax paper and things like that within your home that you use. Same type of thing exists within industrial food production. And so it's one where just because you control for the finished product and use BPA finished packaging, it doesn't mean that unless you use and ask more questions of your suppliers further up the supply chain, there could be contamination taking place further up the road too. So it's a matter of being a cynical consumer. When they make claims, ask questions and demand answers, because sometimes it's like BPA free of like, okay, yep, your packaging is completely BPA free, but your BPA contaminated whatever happens to be doing a real number on your BPA free packaging. So it's one where sometimes it's not just about the packaging that's the problem. It's interesting because BPA also serves like, and I don't think people understand this, like BPA actually serves an important role. I completely understand why industry uses it. BPA is a liner in different types of packaging containers that help extend the shelf life. And 80% of the food industry uses what's called co-manufacturers. Co-manufacturer is you're actually a brand, but you use another facility that actually does the food production. And the way that it works is that when you're doing food production, you can do a larger run. In other words, produce more products at one time. And you get a better rate at that. It's just about leveraging economies of scale. The kicker is that by doing that, you're going to have more product that's going to sit on a shelf for a longer period of time. So the benefits of BPA, it actually extends the shelf life by making sure that it doesn't start to have, the product doesn't start to break down. So industry, that are making those choices in packaging are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Okay, we can use the non-BPA packaging, which is a little bit more expensive. I'm also going to have a shorter shelf life. Or I can use the BPA lined packaging that ultimately I'll be able to save money on the food production process as well as have a longer shelf life. But nevertheless, also comes with the risk that obviously once it starts to break down, you have the packaging migration issues. So BPA is a really interesting chemical to watch. So often people do, when they're doing testing of their food products, they look at product stability and they look at safety and they look at microbial contamination and things like that. Oftentimes they don't look at how is my packaging actually breaking down as part of that process.
Mm-hmm. I've seen in stores a lot of cans now say BPA free. Does that mean there's another bisphenol in the lining, or is it completely different chemical? Do you know anything about these kind of newer cans?
Oh, I don't know, but I would guess. I mean, that's another thing too, is it's hard and it's always a moving target because the first initial bad guy was BPA. And so that everyone stopped using BPA, but then they switched to something called BPS. And so then it's one where it's kind of like, again, going back to that whole thing of like, you don't want to switch one poison for another poison. And it's like, oh, you get a pat on the back for now having BPA, even though you swapped it for this other bad one over here. So it's kind of a moving target. It would be interesting to see how to test for more of those biphenyls as part of that process.
I'll send you some cans.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
All right. Do you have kind of one or two things that consumers can do, maybe on the easier side of things they can do to try to limit exposure to some of these chemicals in their food and products?
Absolutely. So when it comes to limiting your exposure, especially to things like plastics and plasticizers, heavy metals, pesticides is kind of within the scope of a Clean Label project, what we look at. First, it would be a matter, and I even learned this one from you guys, but it obviously makes sense. So often when you go and you get carry out, it'll end up in obviously your plastic containers. Don't heat things in plastic containers. If you can, obviously transition it over to ceramic or glass. When you're buying products, make sure to store them in plastic and glass. I mean, I know that within my house, I struggle with this whole thing because I'm also really try to be an environmental steward in terms of not throwing away plastic and not throwing away, single-use things and stuff like that. But it's also one where as things start to kind of fall apart and you get rid of them, replacing it with just glass and really good quality, for when you've got leftovers and things like that to store in the fridge. And then you don't feel so bad when you're warming it up, it's still okay. When you stick it in the oven, it's still okay. So I would say those are really, really important places to start that are easy fixes in terms of day to day in your home.
Great, and I'll put a little plug in for our approved product list on our Million Marker website. We do have a lot of recommendations for food storage containers that people can look into.
Yeah, also these food storage containers, Tina actually contacted every manufacturer to actually make sure, okay, are you actually using BPA lining or are you using BPA alternatives? So we definitely got confirmation from these manufacturers.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, one thing we can't do yet is test the products themselves, but that's something we would like to do in the future as well, along the lines of what you guys work on. So back to the companies themselves, how do they respond to the work of the Clean Label Project? Have you had positive feedback or any kind of negative feedback or pushback with your work?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's either a love or a hate relationship. I have one PR gal that she tells me, like, listen, Jackie, unless you receive 2 cease and desist letters, you haven't done your job in terms of making sure that it gets out there to consumers. Because let's be honest, it's one where, consumers and consumer reaction ultimately will affect industry change. And if it's one where it affects bottom line, then it's like brands will take action. And so Clean Label Project, the way we look at it is we're nothing but the messenger. Like we talked about, marketing departments do an effective job at selling comfort and security. Go into any grocery store and I dare you to find me one product that on the product package it says, this product is entirely average. Frankly, it doesn't taste very good. Listen, it's a little bit overpriced. We use the BPA lining because we needed to extend that shelf life, but listen, we made our margins. Nothing says that. Everything says it's full of nothing but wholesome goodness, natural. It's the best for this and that. So how do you actually differentiate between the good and the bad? And that's where science comes into it. And at the end of the day, it's one where it's like consumers are left, from like an economic perspective, it's called information asymmetry, where one party knows more information than the other. But if the other party found out about it, they'd be pissed and they'd feel duped. And that's the state of consumers, is so much of it is based on trust. But at its core, though, I would also say that, in no way do I feel that industry across any different categories that they're out there intentionally peppering their products with heavy metals, pesticides, plastics. Quite the contrary. I feel like industry wants to do the right thing. But from an engineering perspective, what gets measured gets done. And in the absence of federal and public policy requiring heavy metals, pesticides, plastics to be part of that whole food safety regulatory fabric in America, it's just something that's not being paid attention to. So much of the food safety regulatory fabric in America is focused on things like E. coli, salmonella, listeria, things that'll have an acute exposure resulting in vomiting, diarrhea, sometimes worse, within 24 to 72 hours. When you're talking about plastics, heavy metals, pesticides, it can take years, even decades, to manifest itself in chronic disease. What you don't hear about people saying is like, this is going to, because you ate something yesterday, you're going to automatically have this other effect tomorrow. It just doesn't happen that way. So it's a matter of, right now, I definitely think there is change in the air, but it's something that's not going to happen soon.
Yeah, agreed. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. I had to move to another room. I was going to ask you a follow-up question on that. Yeah, it seems too like it's hard for consumers themselves sometimes to hear this information. Like they don't want to know that what they've been buying has been bad for them or bad for their families, and there's maybe some pushback there as well. So I found in terms of educating consumers, there's a certain amount of kind of understanding that feeling as well.
I would agree with you on that. And just like the same thing with industry is that there's so many out there that are also doing really cool progressive things that have been all over it for quite some time. It's like, yeah, we've been watching the trend for like a decade. Like we saw this wave coming a long time ago. Same thing that when you see consumers start talking about and getting concerned about GMOs, it's one where it's like consumers will tell you, influencers will tell you, American Academy of Pediatrics will tell you what it is that families are concerned about. It's just a matter of brands and industry proactively deciding to give a damn and start changing even in the absence of a federal policy requiring them to. But with families, it's also one with consumers. It's sometimes reality is hard. And sometimes the other thing too is that sometimes data will fly in the face of conventional wisdom. One of my biggest examples of that is I will say that, USDA certified organic, absolutely. After testing, thousands, if not tens of thousands of food and consumer products, the USDA certified organic promise of less exposure to pesticides absolutely holds true. However, heavy metals and plastics currently have no role within the USDA National Organic Program standard. The reality is that, unfortunately, less than 1% of agricultural land in the US is certified organic. Because of that, when it comes to requiring, how to create and have access to different type of soil amendments and things like that for farmers, the USDA National Organic Program actually allows for the use of conventional compost. So when it comes to compost, you don't want to use synthetic fertilizers or anything like that within organic. But then what happens is they get conventional compost, which 80% of the time come from conventional chicken facilities. So what you have is like conventional chicken litter. So that's going to be the poop, and it's going to be the feathers and that kind of stuff. And where do heavy metals, and then not to mention you're talking about like high density industrial animal production facilities, and then you've got heavy metals because you potentially have, antibiotic and that kind of stuff exposure as well. And then this is the same type of stuff, that compost that is then allowed to be applied to this, beautiful, pure certified organic fields. And then the result of it is, sometimes you see elevated levels of heavy metals in some certified organic products. It puts us between a rock and a hard place because you absolutely want to support organic, so many benefits associated with that. But on the other side, we've got this very real reality that, right now, access to organic in terms of agriculture here domestically is quite limited.
Yeah.
Seems that transparency is going to be so important through the supply chain. And then you almost want to like put everything on blockchain to be transparent.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, it's also one where, even along those lines too, another trend that we see is agricultural commodity regional variability. So you can look, for example, when you're talking about rice, over on the west coast, you've got a cleaner rice source in the southeastern U.S. because in the southeastern U.S., decades ago, it was primarily looking at tobacco and cotton. You look at the pesticides that are applied to those types of agricultural commodities. You look at the half-life, the breakdown components. And, right now, those rice plants have no choice but to suck up, the contaminants that are in the ground. And the other reality too, which you can't ignore, is that, where these different types of contaminants are coming from, at least when you're talking about heavy metals, is that, at the end of the day, we have to sleep in the bed that we've made, from a societal perspective, because of our choices around mining, fracking, industrial agriculture, the use of recycled wastewater. These contaminants end up in the air, the water, and the soil. And because of that, it's one where it's like, these are just, sometimes these levels of contaminants that are in the soil and the water that end up in our food. These are externalities from other industries that have this adverse effect both on food and agriculture and ultimately on public health.
Yeah. So moving into some of your work with heavy metals, I've been seeing a lot of media coverage on Clean Label Project's work with heavy metals in baby food products. Can you tell us more about your efforts as it relates to supporting the Baby Food Safety Act of 2021?
Sure. So Clean Label Project, we published a peer-reviewed study back in 2019 looking at the levels of lead and cadmium in America's best-selling infant formulas and baby food. Those are always important. Baby food, and just looking at what we feed to America's most vulnerable populations, is always interesting. So the World Health Organization considers the first 1,000 days of life as critically important to long-term health and wellness of a newborn human. Not to mention, it's the window of opportunity where optimum brain and immune system development are established. So it is where it's like, what is it that we're actually feeding these kiddos? Looking at when you test this stuff, it's one where you see, it's always interesting when you see single data points, and you guys, I'm sure, love looking at analytical chemistry test reports, but it's like when you have like big data and you're like, whoa, I've got like 500 products, each of them with 400 data points. What I always find most fascinating is like, you can see the mean and median, and those are interesting. But then, I love looking at like the statistical outliers of like, what are the common denominators of these crazy numbers? What are the common denominators of like the products that consistently test well? So along those lines, it's interesting that we were able, fortunately, in order to lend a hand over to the different representatives that are working on the Baby Food Safety Act of 2021, based on our knowledge of like, nope, there's certain ingredients that are higher risk. Nope, there's certain things that are realistic to achieve in terms of an infant formula, especially with infant formula. It's the exclusive form of nourishment for so many babies during that critical period of development. Infant formula is the most highly regulated food in America when it comes to nutrition. But here it is that it's one where we don't pay attention from a heavy metal perspective. Not to mention that it's also one with infant formula, you've got the cumulative effect, right? You take the water and you mix it with the formula, you've got both of them. So if you've got a drinking water problem and an infant formula problem, then it's even a worse situation. So yes, we've been able to lend some of our expertise of what we've observed over the past few years investigating what we feed to America's most vulnerable populations.
That's great. And it really shows how these kinds of big data sets and work of nonprofits and work that these organizations are doing can help with regulatory, policy making and things like that. The government testing programs aren't always going to cover what's needed to make these laws.
Absolutely. Yes. And just being able to, wherever possible, trying to advance the science, advance public health, it's a good thing. And just even having the conversation and that platform to be able to do so is pretty amazing.
Yeah. So could we go into a little bit about how the Clean Label certification project or certification program works, how you certify your baby food, your other food products, and their personal care products?
Sure. So as I mentioned, the way we look at the world is that compliance with the food safety regulatory requirements, that's table stakes. So along those lines, one of the first things we require is that they have proof of food safety, right? Your GFSI benchmark standards, certify HACCP, which would be your hazard and critical control point analysis, supplier assurance program, your HARP-C programs, hazard analysis, preventive risk controls, that you've got the checks and balances in place to make sure you get a reproducibly good product when it comes to kind of traditional food safety. The next thing that we do is we do testing of their actual finished products. And what we do at the test results is we actually benchmark them to the categories that we have benchmark data. So to put that into perspective of like when I mean benchmarking and what I really consider to be Clean Label Project special sauce is that, for those of you that have kiddos at home, when you take your kid to the pediatrician, let's say, for their 3-month checkup or 6-month checkup, and they're like, okay, we're going to get the height, we're going to get the weight, we're going to get the head circumference. They measure their height and be like, okay, she's at the 50th percent, or, she measures at however tall. We'll just say we'll do head circumference. We'll say at 6 months, 16 centimeters. I just happen to remember that stat. Okay. Yep. She's right on, she's right 50th percentile. She's right on target where she needs to be. Perfect. But if they happen to say to you like, okay, she measures at 16 centimeters. Naturally, as a parent, you'd be like, well, is that good? Is that bad? Is that normal? I don't know. When you have benchmark data and you're like, well, compared to all other 16-month-old babies, she's completely at the 50th percentile. She's completely on average. Similarly, they're able to say, okay, looking at the height and the weight, she's at the 95th percentile. Look like you might have a basketball player in the making. Or maybe if she's on the tiny side in terms of the weight, she's at the 7th percentile. Let's make sure she gets all the nutrients that she needs in order to grow and thrive. Or, maybe she's just going to be petite, and that's okay too. Having access to benchmark data gives you more of that competitive insight of how does my product actually stack up to everybody else's. That's the way the Clean Label Project certification program works, that we test their product essentially to over 400 industrial and environmental contaminants, including phthalates, BPA, BPS, your heavy metals, and your pesticides, as well as a few other things, depending on the category. And then we take those test results and we benchmark them to, well, how did all the other products in this category generally perform? Whether that category is baby food, infant formula, protein powder, deodorants. And then you're able to say, okay, compared to all these other ones, your product is in, you can be able to say like, you're in this percentile. And you may, just like if you think about it, almost like in grade school, if you take a science class, a math class, an English class, and a Spanish class, You don't have to get straight A's in order to make the honor roll. You don't have to have absolute perfection in order to make the honor roll. You just need to be in the top 30% of your class in terms of the way Clean Label Project looks at the world. You know, one of the things that's so important to note is that things like heavy metals are naturally occurring in the Earth's crust. So you're never going to get a non-detect. Likewise, even just this current state and capabilities of science when it comes to testing for plastics as well as pesticides, again, rarely do you see non-detects. I mean, it depends on the levels of sensitivity, of course, but sometimes you'll get small hits and things like that, or you can only test down to a certain sensitivity. So what we look at is you're also able to see certain interesting things of like, looking at the 560, different baby foods, you're one of 7 that has a glyphosate hit. That's one where it's like, that's clearly an anomaly of like, if we're going to pinpoint where that came from, chances are it's one of your grain-based ingredients. Do some more homework there to figure out that root cause analysis, because obviously glyphosate, the active ingredient Roundup, which has links to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, obviously that's a hot button right now. So we're able to give that kind of insight back to brands to help them kind of navigate forward. But again, these are things that are really important to consumers as well.
Yeah, great. As a consumer, how do you find this information?
Yes. So first I would say, obviously, Clean Label Project is a great resource. I love you guys for having access. You're so focused on kind of like the endocrine disruption stuff, focusing on, BPA phthalates, which I love that. Clean Label Project is a great resource in terms of identifying the brands that are proactively having their products randomly screened for these types of contaminants. But then as a whole, if it's one where it's like, Clean Label Project certifies dozens of, hundreds of products, dozens of different brands. But if they're not certified, either tell them they should be, but even along those lines, go on social media, ask questions, demand answers, especially with social media, allows you to do that publicly and hold brands accountable for that information. And it's really important for if you have certain products in your home that are favorites of your family, then do your homework and making sure that it's the best fit for you.
And people can just go to your website to look up certain products?
Definitely at cleanlabelproject.org, and as well as just check us out on social. We're always talking about stuff and, new articles and science and studies that are coming out related to the topics that are important to us, looking at long-term chronic disease and its links back to industrial environmental contaminants.
That's great.
It's also really interesting you mentioned about benchmarking, and this is also giving us also a plugin that, when we do measure human exposure, we also kind of do benchmarking also on percentile stage, because these chemicals are very hard to have a non-detect, like it's literally like everywhere.
Yeah.
So like our goal is also same as Clean Label Project. We want to empower consumers. You might not be able to get rid of everything, but at least like these chemicals have no business to be in your body. You want to get rid of as much as possible. And same as in the industry too, that, there might be hardships. We can't get rid of everything, but at least we're trying our best.
Well, and it's interesting when you say it that way too, because especially if you get different types of information on people of like, this is their age, their demographic, what they eat, how active they consider themselves, do they take supplements and things like that. You'd be like, okay, well, compared to other 30 to 50-year-old women, you're in the whatever percentile when it comes to the level of this in your blood. And then it helps put in perspective. If you're like, okay, I'm about average, well, yeah, I probably should eat less of this, or, transition my whatever plastic containers and those kinds of things. But then it's one where you're able to show them like, listen, you have the absolute highest amount of this I've ever seen in somebody. Then it's like such an eye-opening experience. So you guys, it's interesting because you're able to get down to that personal health level, right? It's not just a matter of like, I'm looking at it as here's what you're consuming, how that actually manifests itself, for example, into like blood lead levels or other kind of levels. I don't see that. But you guys are able to see that. And so how people can change their own personal habits can be much more like, and they can literally do it today once they learn from Million Care.
And I see potential collaboration in the future because you're able to test for the external exposures and we can test internal, and we can definitely do some important work there.
Absolutely.
So are there any upcoming projects that Clean Label Project is involved in?
Yeah, I've got a few things in the works. I'd say the next one that I'm excited about, we were able to receive this really generous grant from the Rose Foundation to look at levels of asbestos in consumer products. So obviously you guys are probably familiar with what took place with Johnson & Johnson when it comes to baby powder. Well, talc isn't just used in talcum powder. It's also one where talc is an active ingredient, or not an active ingredient. It's an important ingredient in supplements, in cosmetics. So we were able to use that grant in order to go out, purchase some different cosmetic products, different kinds of supplements, and look at the levels of potentially different types of asbestos within those products. So we'll be publishing our findings from that study here soon. I also have a few more studies in the process of going through peer review evaluation right now, and hope to have those published and out in the marketplace before the end of the summer.
That's really cool. I'm excited to see that. When I had my baby, I didn't use any kind of talc or baby powder or anything, but I know, yeah, like you said, it's another product. So
it is, yes.
Yeah. I think, is it in Tums or antacids?
Oh God, yes.
Yeah.
It is. It
So
is.
you're literally eating it. Oh my God.
I know. And then it's like, and it's interesting too, you'll appreciate this. It's like, I'm really used to looking at analytical chemistry test reports. Like I know how to think about things in terms of parts per million, parts per billion, different types of like micrograms per milliliter, different things of thinking of that way. But asbestos test reports look totally different. And so it's literally, I'm having to figure out like, what am I looking at here? It's like, you have the different scientists that can interpret it for me, but I'm like, I have a hard time of figuring out like, how do I think about it? It's just because it's like they use air and they use little doors and they capture fibers and count them. And so it's a different way of thinking about it. But nevertheless, I'm really excited about getting those findings out.
Yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah, this makes like clean label projects work really important, because I think this is also part of the science translation, right? Like you're reading these reports for consumers, like conveying this message to them, rather than them, like not everyone needs to be trained as a chemist to really read these, because even understanding parts per million, parts per billion, that's like super, super tiny amount, like people like really have hard time picturing.
Yeah.
So this work is so important.
Absolutely. And the thing is, it's like there's so many consumers out there that love to kind of pop the hood, kick the tires. They want to see the analytical chemistry test reports. I want to provide them. But then it's also along the lines of like, just to Joanna's point, it's one where it's like, if you're a new mom, you're busy. You've got maybe a kid on your hip over here. You've got another one screaming over here. And you want the Cliff Notes version, and there's nothing wrong with that too. And so we look to kind of have a little bit of both for those people that also want to like nerd out with us, by all means. But then for those that just want the Cliff Notes version of like, okay, which one should I go with? Which one should I stay away from? We love providing the Cliff Notes version too.
Yeah, we try to walk that line a bit.
It's hard, right? I mean, trying to articulate, the balance, and I already talk about it. It's like explaining toxicology, chemistry, and statistics in, ways that everyone can understand. And especially even from a marketing perspective. I mean, brands are still trying to, sell things and trying to talk about it. And it's like so easy to get into the weeds on it, but it's a fun topic.
Well, and two, it's a field of study that needs a lot of different kinds of experts. Like you said, the statistician, the epidemiologist, the toxicologist, the chemist, there's, the marketer.
Absolutely.
So that's kind of what we all try to bring together as well as we can. So just kind of reaching back to, or circling back to some practical things that people can do. How do you get consumers to look beyond these product marketing labels to?
Yeah, I would say as a whole, how to get them to look past it. At the end of the day, I personally find right now, consumers are the new arbiters of truth and transparency. There was a study that came out a few years back. I'm trying to think of the source right now. Pew research on trust. And one of the things that they found was that something like 7% trust in the federal government. And so the thing is, it's like when someone is just like thinking of like, no, we comply with federal regulations, like what federal regulations, along those lines, it's one where if you provide access to consumers, they can make access to information for consumers, they'll make the choice of what's the best fit for their family. Just like we always see, just like when you go to the store, there's ones where it's like certified organic is important for some people, non-GMO is important for others, certified kosher is important to others. And it's one where some of them may look at it as like, okay, there's different critical periods in somebody's life, like getting pregnant or being diagnosed with some type of disease that can really affect how they approach their health and wellness. And it's a matter of you provide them access to that information and allow them to make the choice of, what makes the most sense for you. And I think for me, that's what makes sense. Just provide consumers the information, they'll decide.
Right. Back to that transparency thing.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay, I think I'm through the questions. We kind of covered everything, I believe, unless anyone else has any questions for Jackie. So I guess I just, if there's any other points that you wanted to make that we didn't cover, please.
I saw Jenna trying to talk. I think she was
Oh,
muted.
sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, I saw that we have one other question. This might be a question from either our Instagram followers or users. We talk a lot about leaching from packaging here. So we're wondering about your thoughts on packaging, for example, like milk cartons. Is there anything like, leaching from milk cartons or other things?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know what? I'm not exactly positive, Jenna. Maybe you would know, because I'm thinking about there's like so many new interesting containers coming out, right? You've got, your traditional cardboard, which I'm sure has some type of liner in there, as well as potentially an antibacterial of some sort in there. And then of course you've got your plastic ones. And now there's all kinds of really new fun things around recyclable plastics and things like that, where I'm not exactly sure. And I'd be interested in the science on that of like, we want to encourage recycling, of course, but then it's one where it's like, when you're not talking about virgin plastic, is there any different kind of exposure that comes from non-virgin plastic? Do you guys happen to know that?
We actually have been looking into that, but there is no, I think like so far, based on our research, there is nothing conclusive.
Okay.
So one thing is, by all the new biodegradable plastic, PHA and all these things, supposed to be good, but however, we don't really have any, longitudinal studies or anything to actually, learn how good these things are, or if they have any like detrimental impact. At the same time, one other issue, at least our vision that we're trying to address, is that this whole mixture effect that, we have been studying one chemical at a time and we're testing one chemical at a time, but we get exposed to so many things all at the same time. But how do we actually look at that?
Oh, it's true. That's a great way to put it. So many of the studies you look at is like, yep, here's how lead is linked to this type of heart issue or brain damage, in laboratory animals. But, the thing is, we're not just, exposed to lead. We've got lead and cadmium and arsenic and, and phthalates and antibiotic residues. And how does all of this affect the microbiome? And how does all of this affect long-term health? I mean, first, nobody's going to be out there doing an actual, clinical study on human exposure. Let's just dose these people with high levels of lead and see what happens for 30 years. Like nothing like that is going to be happening right now. So it's one where you're right. I mean, it's very incomplete information, and we even more so limited when it comes to the cumulative effect of these exposures.
I was the one who asked about the milk cartons, and I was specifically thinking of the Tetra Packs.
Oh, okay.
If that, like, I think if we saw it, it would be a very noticeable logo that's on.
Oh, I'm familiar with it. Yeah, it's on the bottom. It's like on the aseptic containers. I know it's exactly which one.
I don't really know what is that, like recyclable. I mean, that's not the main point, but is the lining in that safe, or has that been tested?
You know what? I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know, but that would be a good one.
Okay. Yeah. I was just curious because it's in a lot of milk.
It's showing up on and not to mention even on the plant-based milks is where I feel like I see it a lot, right? On your almond, your soy, and your cashew and all those. Yep. I agree with you.
I think I've seen those too for what are they called? Tomatoes.
Yeah.
Okay. Tomatoes are a really bad one for the can lining because they're acidic. And so what they do is they leach the BPA from the cans into the tomato. So if you can get something that's not canned for your tomatoes, that's great. But yeah, we don't know much about the Tetra Pak.
Yeah. And there's also that, I think I sent, but the BPI non-intent, where they don't intentionally add BPA. but then
It's like I pinky swear we don't mean to add it. It's kind of like one of those allergen statements of like, here it is someone who has like an allergy, but on the back of pack, it's like doesn't contain allergens, but it was created in a facility that handles nuts and dairy and all this stuff. You're like, what? It's like, it's one of those where it's like, it's pretty non-committal where I don't give anyone, nobody gets a gold star for making that claim in my book.
Okay. Yeah.
I think that's just a way to avoid lawsuit or something.
Oh, probably. Yeah.
Most likely another kind of like a marketing thing.
Well, I mean, it goes back to that whole thing with claims too, is like so often you'll see and have these conversations all the time. You'll see claims on packs that say, like, for example, paraben free, phthalate free. And I'll be like, now do they mean free, like in the science perspective, that it's an absolute zero? Because I highly doubt that. Do they mean that it's like, we didn't intentionally add it to the product, but listen, we can't speak for our supply chain, or does it mean paraben free because we've tested down to 1 part per million and we didn't see it at that level. I can't say it wasn't there at the parts per billion level, that it's so often you see these claims with these very obscure or completely absent definitions behind them. And that's where it comes back to, consumers holding brands accountable to ask questions and demand answers.
Yeah, I remember seeing, sorry, go ahead, Jill.
Oh, I was just going to say, I got some pear stuff and it said, no spoonfuls of paraben added.
What? No spoonfuls?
Oh my, that's so crazy.
That is crazy. You should take a picture of that one and post it somewhere. Like no spoonfuls. It might as well be like, I always like joke around and I'll say things of like, I wouldn't be surprised if I saw a product claim that said no unicorns were harmed in the making of this product. Being like,
oh my God.
So are we saying that the other products, the other oranges were harming unicorns? What are we saying exactly? Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
I remember seeing the EU has BPA free actually regulation, but that regulation is if product is less than say 0.5 milligram per kilogram of BPA, that's considering BPA free. But at the same time, if you actually consume a lot of those, it's like not exactly free. And it's also same as it reminds me of the whole trans fat labeling.
Yes.
With food, trans fat labeling, it's the same thing, less than 0.5 grams per kilogram, then that's trans fat free. But if you consume a lot of trans fat free stuff,
you have a lot of trans fat.
You still have a lot of trans fat because anytime you have hydrogenated oil, you have trans fat. That's just like chemistry.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, that's funny. Yeah. Similar. I mean, we have a gluten-free definition. It's down to 20 parts per million, which from a celiac perspective, my understanding is that's generally protective of those that have celiac disease, but it's also one where it's like 20 part per million, given the capabilities of analytical chemistry these days, like that's a big number. Like you should be able to hit that, brands, if you're making a gluten-free claim, like that is still pretty generous in terms of the amount of gluten that is still allowed.
There's also a measuring, I guess this is another like a big topic in terms of analytical chemistry, is there's also measuring margins, right? Because I remember there was a study back then also again on trans fat. They this agency tested all the food containing or not containing trans fat, and they realized the error rate is almost like 30%. Or in terms of not just trans fat content, but also calorie. You're thinking you're consuming this much, but actually you're consuming 30% more.
Absolutely. And then that's a really good point. I mean, we see it too in terms of, I was having this conversation the other day of like, the nutritional content of a carrot is not the same as every other carrot. It depends on the soil it came out of, the nutrient density. Like, garbage in equals garbage out. Just like we talk about there's contamination that takes place in the soil. If the soil is depleted of vitamins and nutrients, then it's also one where that carrot is not going to absorb all of that same goodness that it once did. So yeah, you're absolutely correct. That variability issue is a very real reality that people don't talk about either.
This is so cool. Anyone have any questions? I think we're almost time.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much.
Awesome. This was
Jack.
Yeah,
great.
thank you, Jack.
Yeah,
We
my
might
pleasure.
have to we might have to split this to 2 episodes because it's like so much good information.
So much.
Oh, I'm
yeah.
anytime you guys want to have a conversation about it, I'm happy to. It's one where we've done, especially when we do like deep dives and you want to like go deep on protein powder, go deep on prenatal vitamins, go deep on these different things. It's like so fascinating, and I love geeking out with you guys, and being in the company of other professional Debbie Downers. It's a good time.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
should definitely do a supplement one because the supplement is like
Yeah.
so interesting, like protein
Yeah.
powder, and especially that supplement because we're trying to focus on the preconception IVF crowd,
Yeah.
and obviously this crowd takes a lot of those, and also
Yeah.
all the biohackers, quantified selves, and into
Yeah.
fitness.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's huge.
One
And
of
I
my
also remember-
peer-reviewed studies covers supplements. So after I get that one published, then we can do a deep dive on it. That'd be fun.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Cool.
Awesome.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks guys. It was good to touch base today.
Maybe do one more soundbite of how people can find your info.
Yep.
Oh,
for,
yeah.
for more information on Clean Label Project, visit us at cleanlabelproject.org or check us out on social media under the handle Clean Label Project.
Great.
Yay. We'll
Yay.
be sharing the podcast link to get your approval before we post.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thanks, guys.
All
We also
right.
Thank
have
you.
an
All right.
official ending for the podcast episode.
Yeah. Oh, do we need an ending for this one?
Yeah.
Okay. What do I
Maybe
say?
just thank Jackie, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So put on the spot. It's been really great talking to you today, Jackie. We've learned so much, and I know people will want to get on your website and look for themselves about all the information you have. So thank you so much, and we hope to talk to you again soon.
Sounds great. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Sorry.
Thanks. All right, cool.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Do we stay on? Do we have to talk?
Yeah, let me finish pause record.